quick note before I get started, I have a special announcement at the end of this episode, so make sure to stay tuned for that. In this episode, we'll be taking a look at Draper. This is a Ruby gem which adds decorators to your views. This is much like a presenter pattern. So if you find yourself with a lot of complex view logic in your templates and helpers, this can really help clean that up through a more object-oriented approach. Let me show you how it works. So this is the application we'll be working with. We have a user profile page here, and we have information like their avatar image, their full username, their website, and if they do have a website, then we link their avatar and name to that website, their Twitter profile, and we have a bio in Markdown. Now this is a pretty simple page, but we have to handle cases where no user information is present, such as this other user profile, Mr. Mystery here, which doesn't contain a lot of information. So for example, we have to provide a default profile image. We have to use our username because we don't have a full name. We have to say none given where we don't have information here. So we have to handle different cases depending on what information a user provides. So here's what that profile template looks like. It's pretty complex with a lot of if conditions and other logic going on here. It would be nice if we could really simplify this template and move a lot of it out somewhere else. And it's all view-related logic here, though, so we can't really extract it out into the model. Another solution is to use helper methods. And in fact, I do have one helper method here called avatar name. Let's take a look at it. So you can see that this here handles the case where it displays a default avatar image when a user's avatar isn't present. And we could fill this up with a lot more methods, but the problem with helper methods is that they're all just simple methods in a global namespace. There's nothing object-oriented about them. So this is a good case for a presenter, or a decorator as Draper refers to them. So the first step is to go to your gem file and add the Draper gem inside of there. And then run the bundle command to install it, and then create a decorator using the Rails generate Draper decorator command, and then pass in the name of the model you want to decorate, such as user. And this will generate an application decorator if you don't have one already, and a user decorator which inherits from the application decorator, so you can place more generic functionality in the application decorator. And here's what that generated decorator looks like. Notice that it has some comments here explaining how it works. But here, let's dive right in and use this to clean up our template. If you take a look at the user's controller show action, which is the profile page, you can see we're just simply fetching the user. And if we want to wrap this in a decorator, what we can do is call user decorator.find instead of user.find. And this will return a user decorator instance which wraps the user record and then delegates all methods to it by default. And so this means our application still works even though we're working on a user decorator and not just a simple user record here. Now we can start cleaning up the view. So we can take this jumbled mess, for example, right here, and which displays the avatar, and just rename this to user.avatar. And that'll call avatar on the decorator. And so inside of our decorator, let's create that avatar method and then do the same thing that we did in our view. Now whenever you have a helper method, such as our link to if call here, you need to call it through the H method, which stands for helpers. And then whenever you reference your model, such as our user model in this case, you could just call model on it, and that'll reference the model of the decorator. So our image tag is a helper method, so we need to call it through that. And then we are referencing a helper method that we created. So it would be nice if we move this into our decorator from our user's helper. So inside of our user's helper module, let's delete the method from inside of here and just paste it inside of our decorator. Let's make it private though, like that. So now when we call this method, we no longer need to pass in the user model because, well, we're inside of our decorator object here. So we just call model instead of user here. And then that way references that user. And then one last fix is that we need to change this to reference model. And there we go. Now we've successfully refactored out that avatar functionality into a single avatar method. So now we can move on to the next line in our template here, which is what's displaying the name and linking it if we have a website. So let's call it this linked name and paste this into a method here called linked name into our decorator. Now notice there's quite a bit of duplication here between the linked name and the avatar because they're both linking to the user's URL if it's present. And since we're in a class, it's pretty easy to just refactor this out. So let's make a new method down here called site link, and then basically do everything the same except allow us to replace the content of the link, which will be right here. So let's just switch out that content. Now we can call this method instead of having all the logic in these other two methods. Much nicer. So we'll need to replace the logic here too, in the link name method. And then we'll just replace any references to user with model. Just like that. And we can reload our page here just to make sure this all works, and it does. And our template is a lot cleaner here. Now let's try refactoring out a larger chunk of view code, such as this section right here, which just displays the user's site information. So let's call user.website. Nice and simple. And then in our decorator, let's add that website method and do the same logic we had in our view. So we need to call if the model's URL is present. Then we want to link to, we need to call h on here because it's a helper method, link to the model's URL. We'll pass that in here. And then otherwise, we want to render out some HTML inside of here. Now, we could just return a string inside of here, but I don't like putting HTML in a Ruby string. Another solution is to move this into a partial and render that from here, which is great if you have a lot of HTML, but here we can get by with a simple call to content tag. So we'll make a span tag here saying none given, and then pass in the class, which is going to be none. Another option is to use a template language such as Markup or maybe Builder. So now let's repeat the same refactoring for these other two parts in the template here. I'll do that really quick. There we go. That looks a lot nicer. I just extracted that part out into the Twitter and bio methods on our decorator. So this view is looking really pretty now, but let's check out our decorator. You can see the two new methods here in our decorator, Twitter and bio. And notice they look very similar to our website method. There's quite a bit of duplication here, especially on this else clause here. It's exactly the same for each one. So it would be nice if we could extract this part out into its own method. And we can use a block to help out with this as well. So here's what I'm thinking. We extract out these two lines and make a method called handle none, and then pass in the value we need to check the presence of, and then pass in a block. And that way, if this value is present, then it executes the block. Otherwise, it shows that span tag. So let's make that method called handle none, takes a value, and then we have an if-else statement to see if the value is present. And if it's not present, we want to render out the span tag, and if it is present, let's yield to the block. So now we can use this method in each of these other method calls, the bio and Twitter. Just clearing out the duplication, clearing out the rendering out the span tag. Now we just have to add a block call here, and that's it. Now those two methods have been refactored out, removed most of the duplication there. Another change we might want to make here is extracting out the markdown rendering into the application decorator so that we can call this method elsewhere as well. So let's just make this red carpet call as simple as call to markdown. And then we can have that markdown method exist inside of the application decorator. So let's make a method here called markdown, and then just toss that same behavior into here and pass in some text that gets converted into markdown using the same approach that we used earlier. Now once you get the decorator in place, it's a good idea to look through the model layer for any view-related code that you can move up to the decorator. For example, here in our user model, we have this method called member since, and this just basically formats the created at time. Now this I consider to be a view-related code because it's formatting the date time to a format that looks nice in the view. So I think this goes in the decorator. So we can move this up into our user decorator by just pasting the method here and then calling model.createdAt inside of here. Now it's moved up into our user decorator. Now while we're inside this user decorator, there's one more feature of Draper that I want to show you, and that is the allows method. because right now this user decorator is going to delegate all methods to the user object, but you can filter out and limit exactly what methods are allowed to be delegated to the user model. By using the allows call, just call allows and then pass in the names of whatever methods you want to delegate, such as username, and that way only the username method will delegate underneath to the user object. And that's really all we need, because that's the only method that's called from inside of our view that's not defined here in our decorator. This way you have more control over the actual interface of your decorator. Now that we're done with refactoring everything out into the decorator, let's try hitting reload here, make sure everything still works, and it does. We can even check the other profile. Everything still looks the same as it did before, we just have much cleaner view code. And here's a quick before and after shot of what we did. Here's what the template looked like initially, and here's what it looks like after our great refactoring. It looks so much more nice and clearer here than what it did before. Before, after. I can look at this all day, it's so much cleaner. And now for the big announcement. Here I am introducing Railscast Pro. For just $9 a month, you can gain access to an additional Pro episode each week, which will dive into more advanced topics. I will also be releasing throughout the week revised versions of older episodes to bring them up to date. In this week's Pro episode, I show you what's involved in creating a presenter from scratch, instead of using a gem such as Draper like I did in this episode. One reason to do this is that it gives you a lot more flexibility to customize it to work the way you want, and it's also not as hard as you might think. In this Pro episode, I will also cover testing presenters, both through Test Unit and RSpec, because it can be a little tricky. So for just $9 a month, you'll gain access to that Pro episode, in addition to the future Pro and revised episodes that will be released. Just head on over to railscast.com/pro to subscribe. Oh, and just in case you're wondering, I will continue to release a free episode each week, just like before, so that will stay the same. I'll see you next week. We've got a fun episode today. We're going to take a look at a couple of different tools that can really help out in development. But first, let me show you this Rails application I have here. There are a couple of different projects, so when I click on a project here, I get this exception. So let's try to figure this out. We have undefined method empty on nil, and it says it's around line 2 here, creating a checkbox. So I don't see any call to empty right here in the view. I suppose we could take a look at the stack trace and figure it out from that, but it seems like this exception page could be improved a bit to help us debug this problem a little easier. And that brings us to the first tool I want to show you here, better errors. This is probably something I'll be adding to every one of my Rails applications because it's just so useful. Not only does the exception page look a lot nicer, but it adds a lot of great functionality to go along with it. Let's try it out. Now, in adding this to the gem file, it's important to specify the development group because we don't want to run the risk of showing our exception details in production. So we can say the better errors gem here, and you'll need to run the bundle command to install it. And if I try restarting my Rails app and re-triggering this exception, it is now handled by better errors. And this time it shows us the exact place in the code where the exception occurred, complete with nice syntax highlighting here. We can see the empty method, which was triggered here. That's what caused the exception. And if we ever want to check up the stack trace, we can just click on here and it will show us the source code related to that part in the stack. And you can also check out the entire Rails app, so any gems you're using, you can see the source code for that gem internals. That way you can figure out exactly what's going on behind the scenes as well. Really awesome. One reason I love this so much is that it helps me better understand how Rails works. You can see that the checkbox method is triggered here, and we can see that method is called on this form builder, and we can go through every step in the process and better understand what's going on. Now further down here, it gives us further information about the request, such as any parameters or cookies which are used. And this isn't all this gem can do, though. If you check this out here, there's a tip to add the binding of collar gem to add a lot more functionality. Let's try that. So in our gem file, I'll add that binding of collar gem again in the development group. And if you're doing this, make sure you're on a trusted network because you don't want any malicious users accessing your Rails app if you're doing this. And then after restarting the app and reloading this page, I get a lot more information here, including the local and instance variables at that point in the code. And this works for any point in the stack trace as well. So if I go further up the stack, at that point here, the local and instance variables. Really cool. But one of the greatest features is the interactive prompt here, which we can also do at any point in the stack trace. So this is where the exception occurred, and we can see that completed at is nil. So if we try calling empty on that, we get that same exception which was raised. So instead of calling not empty on this, I probably want something like completed at is present, and that returns false, which looks like what I want. And to make that change, I can just click on the link here for the file, and that opens it up straight in my editor. Now I'm just going to fix this problem directly here, but I highly recommend you first add an automated test that repeats the bug to ensure that you fixed it and it doesn't come back again. Also, if there's a bug like this, that probably means that our test suite isn't good enough because it didn't catch it in the first place. So anyway, let's try this out. And reloading our page, and it works now, yay! Now let me show you another bug on this application here, and that is if we mark a task as complete by checking this box, it should automatically move it to the completed tasks section and update the record in the database through Ajax, but that isn't working for some reason. If we check out the development log, we can see that an exception was raised on that Ajax request, but wouldn't it be nice if we could see this exception and interact with it through better errors? And we can, simply by going to the path on our Rails application, __ better errors. So this shows us the exception that last occurred, and we can see it matches what we saw in the development log, undefined method 0 for the one string. So let's say the complete add value here, that is the string of 1, and so if we probably want to call to integer on this before seeing if it's a 0 value, and let's see if that works here. That returns false, which is what we want. And we can fix that by opening it in our editor by clicking this link. I just love this link to the editor. And add a quick to call in here. And we could try out our Ajax again, and this time it's working, with all thanks to better errors to help us debug this problem. Now before finishing up our look at better errors, I wanted to point out a couple of things about the editor link. For one thing, it works with internal gem pages as well. So let's say we want to learn how this assign attributes method works more, then we can click on here, and that brings up the exact source code file in TextMate. Really cool. Now if you wanted to customize which editor it opens up when you click on that link, you can do so under maybe just an initializer file in your Rails app. Let's call it better errors, and then we can call better errors .editor, and there are several different symbols you can pass in here. One is Sublime if you want to use that, and it's only do that if we have better errors defined. Now if you check out the RDocs, you can see a list of the different symbols that you can pass in for different editors, or you can also use a string or even a proc object if you want something more custom. Alright, moving along, the other tool I wanted to show you here is called Rails Panel. This is actually an extension for Chrome, which adds sort of like a development log right within the browser. Pretty handy. Let me show you how to set it up. There are some instructions here. You can just go through the Chrome Web Store. Now some have reported that you need to first sign in. I haven't experienced any problems without signing in, but you might want to keep that in mind and try that if you need to. So just say add to Chrome here, and then add this. Now in addition to the extension, you also need to add a gem to your application called meta request, and you'll want to add this to the development group. Now after restarting our Rails app, we can go into the Chrome developer panel, and we have this new Rails panel option here, and when we go throughout various pages of our application, you can see that an entry shows up in the panel. And this works for Ajax requests too. Clicking here, you can see a new entry shows up. So this shows us all kinds of details about the request, what format it was, how long it took to process, various parameters and database queries that happened, and also views that were rendered. And we click on this like we could with Rails error, and it shows it inside of the editor. Really cool. Now if you want to customize which editor the Rails panel uses, just go under the Chrome preferences, under extensions. You can choose options here for the panel and customize the editor there. Now overall, this is a pretty simple tool, but it's really nice to have all this information just inline in the browser instead of having to look in a separate log. Now I want to finish up with some notes about how these tools work. They both use middleware pretty extensively. We can see in this list here the Better Errors middleware and meta request. Now I believe it's important that the meta request gem comes after Better Errors in the gem file, so that way if you're tracking exceptions and events, meta request will be able to track that, and then it passes it on to Better Errors. Unfortunately, I was having some trouble getting exceptions to show up under the Rails panel. Perhaps it's not really supposed to, or maybe I'm doing something wrong. I'm not quite sure yet. I got to look into it more. Well, that wraps up this episode on Better Errors and Rails panel. I want to give a special thank you to the developers of these gems, just for making our lives as Rails developers a little easier. That's it for this episode. Thanks for watching.